The first time I saw the barbed wire fence, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn and ended up at a maximum security prison. But no, this was my dad's hunting cabin. A rustic, charming little slice of Texas wilderness that now looked like it had been commandeered by a paranoid HOA board member with too much time on their hands. The shiny, menacing coils of wire wrapped around the perimeter like some dystopian art installation, and all I could think was, who in their right mind thought this was a good idea? Now, let me back up for a second. My name's Jack, and I'm just your average guy trying to survive post-college life without selling my soul to corporate America. My dad, Thomas, is a quiet man with a knack for staying under the radar. He's the kind of guy who wears flannel shirts unironically and can fix just about anything with duct tape and determination. What most people don't know, because he doesn't go around advertising it, is that he's also the chief of staff for the governor of Texas. Yep, my dad is basically the governor's right-hand man, but you'd never guess it from his laid-back demeanor or his love for hunting trips in this very cabin. The cabin itself is nothing fancy. It's got creaky floorboards, mismatched furniture, and a wood-burning stove that smokes like a chimney on its last legs. But it's ours, or at least it was until the HOA decided to make it their personal playground for absurdity. You see, this cabin is technically part of a community, though calling it that feels generous. It's more like a patch of land where people occasionally nod at each other while pretending not to notice the deer carcasses strapped to their trucks. Somehow, though, this so-called community has an HOA, a homeowners association, which is basically a group of self-appointed neighborhood overlords who exist to make everyone else's life miserable. And let me tell you, this HOA takes its job very seriously. The trouble started when I pulled up to the cabin one Friday afternoon, ready for a weekend of peace and quiet. Instead, I was greeted by the sight of that ridiculous fence. It wasn't just any fence, it was barbed wire, the kind you'd expect to see around Area 51 or maybe a particularly aggressive cattle ranch. There was even a padlocked gate with an official-looking sign that read, HOA-approved security measure. Security measure? For what? The only thing out here worth stealing is my dad's collection of vintage fishing lures. Naturally, I called my dad to ask what was going on. His response was classic Thomas. Calm, measured, and slightly amused. "Oh yeah," he said casually. "I got a letter from the HOA about that last week." "A letter?" I sputtered. "Dad, they've turned our cabin into Fort Knox." "What did the letter say?" "Something about enhancing community safety," he replied. I didn't pay much attention. Enhancing community safety? This is Texas. We don't need barbed wire. We have shotguns. Besides, there are laws about this kind of thing. I'd read somewhere that under Texas state law, specifically Senate Bill 1588, HOAs can't just throw up fences without homeowner approval. They can regulate materials and aesthetics all they want, but they can't force you to build or accept one against your will. Clearly, someone on the HOA board had either skipped that memo or decided they were above the law. Determined to get to the bottom of this nonsense, I drove over to the HOA office, or rather, the tiny trailer they called an office, where I was greeted by Linda, the self-proclaimed president of our illustrious HOA. Linda is exactly what you'd expect from someone who runs an HOA. Middle-aged, perpetually scowling, and armed with an arsenal of passive-aggressive comments. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up from her clipboard. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone polite. "I'm here about the barbed wire fence around my dad's cabin." "Oh," she said with a tight smile. "That was installed as part of our new security initiative." "Security initiative?" I repeated incredulously. "Linda, this isn't Fort Worth. It's a hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere. What exactly are we securing against? Squirrels?" She bristled at my tone but didn't back down. "The board voted unanimously on this measure," she said primly. "It's for the safety of all residents." "All residents?" I shot back. "Linda, there are more raccoons than people out here." She ignored me and launched into some spiel about how crime rates were allegedly rising in rural areas. A claim that sounded suspiciously like something she'd read on Facebook at 2 a.m. When I pointed out that her actions violated state law, she dismissed me with a wave of her hand. "Well," she said smugly, "if you have an issue with it, You're welcome to file a complaint. A complaint? Oh no, Linda wasn't getting off that easy. After leaving the HOA office and resisting the urge to slam the door, I called my dad again to fill him in on Linda's antics. "She sounds delightful," he said dryly when I told him about her attitude. "She's insufferable," I corrected him, "and clearly drunk on power." "Well," he said with a chuckle, "looks like you've got yourself a little project." Project? That was putting it mildly. As far as I was concerned, this wasn't just about taking down a fence. It was about taking down Linda and her petty dictatorship one ridiculous rule at a time. But first things first, I needed evidence. So I spent the rest of that weekend digging through legal documents like some kind of amateur detective. Sure enough, everything pointed back to Senate Bill 1588, the very law that made Linda's fence stunt illegal. Armed with this knowledge and fueled by righteous indignation, I started drafting emails to every HOA board member I could find. By Sunday night, I had enough material for what could only be described as an epic takedown letter. A masterpiece of sarcasm and legal jargon designed to make even Linda think twice before crossing me again. And thus began my journey into the absurd world of HOA politics. A journey filled with petty power struggles, laughable bureaucracy, and more drama than any hunting cabin should ever have to endure. Little did Linda know, she'd picked the wrong family to mess with. By Monday morning, I was ready to go to war. Not the kind of war that involves actual weapons, though let's be honest, this is Texas, so that's always an option, but the kind of war fought with emails, legal citations, and a whole lot of passive-aggressive energy. My first target? The HOA board itself. If Linda wanted to play games, I was more than happy to play along. Except in my version of Monopoly, I was the guy flipping the board and walking away with all the fake money. Now, let me tell you something about HOAs. They thrive on bureaucracy. They love forms, procedures, and rules so obscure that even the people who wrote them don't fully understand them. So naturally, I decided to beat them at their own game. I started by drafting a formal complaint letter, a masterpiece of legalese and sarcasm that I'm honestly considering framing someday. The letter began like this: "Dear esteemed members of the HOA board and Linda, I am writing to express my grave concerns regarding the recent installation of a barbed wire fence around my father's property. While I appreciate your commitment to community safety, I must point out that your actions are not only unnecessary but also in direct violation of Texas Senate Bill 1588, Section 209.007A, which clearly states that homeowners must consent to any structural alterations proposed by the HOA." I went on for 3 pages, yes, 3 whole pages, detailing every single way they'd screwed up. I cited laws, referenced case studies, and even threw in a few choice phrases like gross overreach and blatant disregard for homeowner rights. By the time I was done, I felt like a cross between Perry Mason and a very annoyed Yelp reviewer. Satisfied with my handiwork, I sent the letter via email and certified mail because nothing says, I mean business, like making someone sign for their own humiliation. Then I waited, and waited, and waited some more. A week went by with no response. Not even an automated "thank you for your feedback" email. It was as if my letter had vanished into some HOA black hole where complaints go to die. Meanwhile, the barbed wire fence remained firmly in place, mocking me every time I drove past it. But then came the kicker. A second letter from the HOA arrived in my dad's mailbox. This one wasn't about the fence, it was about fines. According to Linda and her merry band of tyrants, my dad owed $500 for failure to comply with community standards. Community standards? What community? The deer? The squirrels? The tumbleweeds? The letter went on to list a series of alleged violations, including improper lawn maintenance, because apparently wild grass is supposed to be mowed, and unauthorized outdoor decoration, which turned out to be an old tire swing hanging from a tree. It was clear they were trying to strong-arm us into submission, but if they thought a $500 fine was going to scare us off, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. I called my dad immediately. "Did you see this?" I asked, holding up the letter as if he could somehow see it through the phone. "Oh yeah," he said casually. "I got it yesterday. And you're not mad?" I demanded. "Well," he said with a chuckle, "it's not like they can actually enforce it. He had a point. Under Texas law, specifically Section 209.006 of the Texas Property Code, HOAs can't just slap you with fines without giving you proper notice and an opportunity for a hearing. And even then, there are limits on what they can do to collect those fines. But still, it was the principle of the thing. They're trying to bully us, I said firmly. Sounds like it, he agreed. What are you going to do about it? What was I going to do about it? Oh, just wait. The next day, I marched back into Linda's office or trailer, with a copy of their letter in hand and fire in my eyes. Linda, I said sweetly as she looked up from her desk with her usual scowl. We need to talk. She sighed heavily, as if dealing with me was somehow cutting into her busy schedule of terrorizing homeowners. What is it now? She asked. I slapped the letter down on her desk. This, I said sharply. This is what it is. She glanced at it briefly before setting it aside like it was yesterday's junk mail. That's standard procedure, she said dismissively. Standard procedure? I repeated incredulously. Linda, this isn't standard. It's extortion. Her eyes narrowed at that word. We're well within our rights, she said defensively. No, I shot back, pulling out a printed copy of Senate Bill 1588. Because yes, I came prepared. You're not within your rights. In fact, you're violating multiple sections of state law. I proceeded to read aloud from the document like some kind of deranged preacher at a legal revival meeting. An association may not impose fines without providing written notice that includes a description of the violation and an opportunity for a hearing. Did we get a hearing notice? No. Did we even get proper notice? Also no. Linda looked visibly uncomfortable now but tried to maintain her composure. Well, she said stiffly, if you have an issue with our policies, it's not your policies, I interrupted. It's your blatant disregard for basic homeowner rights. At this point, another board member, a meek-looking man named Gary, poked his head into the office as if sensing drama brewing. Everything okay in here? He asked nervously. No, Linda snapped before turning back to me. We'll review your concerns and get back to you. Oh no, I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. You're going to address this now. And address it we did, or rather, I did while Linda sat there silently fuming and Gary shuffled awkwardly in the background. By the time I left that office an hour later, I'd made it abundantly clear that we weren't backing down, and that if they wanted a fight, they'd better be prepared for one hell of a battle. As I walked out into the sunshine feeling victorious, one thought crossed my mind. This wasn't just about fences or fines anymore. This was personal. By the time I got home from my showdown with Linda, I was riding high on a wave of righteous indignation. I mean, who did these people think they were? Slapping fines on my dad for unauthorized outdoor decorations and improper lawn maintenance, like we were living in some suburban utopia, instead of a patch of Texas wilderness where the only real lawnmowers are grazing deer. It was laughable, but also infuriating, and I was just getting started. The next step in my campaign against the HOA was to gather evidence. If they wanted to play dirty, I was going to play smarter. So, I spent the better part of the week digging through every HOA document I could get my hands on, bylaws, meeting minutes, even their financial reports. And let me tell you, it was a goldmine of incompetence. For starters, their bylaws were a mess. Half of them contradicted each other, and the other half were so poorly written that they might as well have been in another language. One section claimed that all fences had to be painted white, while another said fences weren't allowed at all. And don't even get me started on their budget. According to their financials, they'd spent over $10,000 last year on administrative expenses, which I'm pretty sure is HOA speak for Linda's Starbucks addiction. But the real kicker came when I stumbled across a little nugget buried in their meeting minutes from 6 months ago. Apparently, the board had voted to install the barbed wire fence after a security incident involving a raccoon that had gotten into someone's trash. That's right, this entire fiasco was because of a raccoon. Not exactly the crime wave Linda had been trying to sell me on. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to take things up a notch. So I called in reinforcements, my dad's lawyer friend, Steve. Now, Steve isn't your typical lawyer. He's more like a legal bulldog with a penchant for Hawaiian shirts and bad puns. But he knows his stuff when it comes to HOA law, and he was more than happy to help. "Jack," he said when I explained the situation to him over the phone. "This is textbook HOA overreach. They don't have a leg to stand on." "Great," I said eagerly. "So what do we do?" "Well," he said thoughtfully, "first we hit them with a cease and desist letter for the fines and the fence. Then we file a formal complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission." "Perfect," I said, already imagining Linda's face when she got served with legal papers. Steve laughed. "Oh, and one more thing," he added. "Make sure you document everything. Emails, letters, photos of the fence, everything." So that's exactly what I did. Over the next few days, I turned into a one-man evidence-gathering machine. I took pictures of the fence from every angle, made copies of all the HOA letters we'd received, and even recorded myself reading excerpts from their bylaws just for good measure. Meanwhile, Steve worked his magic on the legal side of things. Within a week, Linda and her cronies had received not one but 2 cease and desist letters. One for the illegal fence and another for the bogus fines they tried to impose on my dad. The letters were beautifully worded, equal parts professional and scathing, and they made it clear that if the HOA didn't back down immediately, we'd be taking them to court. Now, you'd think this would have been enough to make Linda see reason. But no. Instead of admitting defeat like any sane person would have done, she doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the escalating situation with my dad's property, which is HOA code for, how do we get rid of this annoying family? Naturally, I decided to attend. The meeting was held in the community center, a dingy little building with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs that smelled faintly of mildew, and it was packed with people. Apparently, word had gotten out about our feud with Linda, and everyone wanted to see how it would play out. Linda kicked things off by giving a long-winded speech about community values and the importance of following rules. She talked about how the fence was necessary for safety, because raccoons are apparently public enemy number 1, and how my dad's alleged violations were setting a bad example for everyone else. I let her ramble on for a while before finally raising my hand. "Excuse me," I said politely when she paused for breath, "but can you clarify something for me?" She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Of course. You keep saying this fence is for safety," I began. "But according to your own meeting minutes from 6 months ago," I held up a printed copy for everyone to see, "the only security incident you cited as justification for the fence involved a raccoon." There was an audible gasp from the crowd as Linda's face turned beet red. "That's not relevant," she snapped. "Oh, but it is," I countered, "because it shows that this whole thing is based on nothing more than fearmongering and poor decision-making." At this point, Gary, the meek board member who'd been lurking in Linda's shadow since day one, tentatively raised his hand. Actually," he said nervously, "I think Jack has a point." Linda shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Thank you, Gary," she said through gritted teeth before turning back to me. "Is there anything else?" "Actually, yes," I said cheerfully as I pulled out another stack of papers. "I'd also like to point out that your fines are completely unenforceable under Texas law because you failed to provide proper notice or an opportunity for a hearing." More gasps from the crowd. And finally, I added with a triumphant grin, "I'd like everyone here to know that if this fence isn't removed within 30 days, as per our cease and desist letter, we'll be filing a formal complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission and pursuing legal action against the HOA." By now, Linda looked like she wanted to crawl under her chair and disappear. The rest of the meeting was pure chaos as residents started arguing amongst themselves about whether or not they should side with us or stick with Linda's increasingly shaky leadership. By the time it was over, one thing was clear: we'd won this round. As I walked out of that community center feeling like David after slaying Goliath, or at least mildly annoying him, one thought kept running through my mind. This wasn't just about fences anymore. It was about standing up to bullies like Linda who think they can get away with anything just because they have a title and some power. The fallout from the HOA meeting was nothing short of spectacular. It was like watching a reality TV show unfold in real life, except instead of dramatic rose ceremonies or people getting voted off an island, It was Linda trying to cling to her crumbling empire of barbed wire and arbitrary fines. And let me tell you, it was glorious. The first sign that things were unraveling came the very next morning when I got an email from Gary. You remember Gary, the nervous board member who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else during that meeting? Well, apparently, the man had finally grown a spine, or at least decided he didn't want to go down with Linda's sinking ship. His email was short and to the point. Hi Jack. I just wanted to let you know that I've reviewed the HOA bylaws and your concerns are valid. I'll be bringing this up with the board at our next meeting. Best, Gary. Now, I don't know what kind of internal drama was going on behind the scenes, but based on that email and the fact that Linda didn't immediately fire back with some snarky response, I could only assume that Gary wasn't the only one questioning her leadership. And honestly, couldn't have happened to a more deserving person. But here's where things took an even funnier turn. A few days later, my dad got another letter from the HOA, except this time, it wasn't a fine or a threat. No, this letter was an official apology. Well, sort of. Dear Mr. Thomas. It began in the most passive-aggressive tone imaginable. We regret any misunderstanding regarding recent HOA policies and enforcement actions. Please rest assured that we are committed to resolving this matter amicably and in accordance with community standards. Translation: We're sorry we got caught. The letter went on to say that the board would be holding a special meeting to reassess the barbed wire fence and other recent decisions. They also mentioned something about forming a committee to review HOA policies moving forward, which I'm pretty sure was just their way of trying to save face without actually admitting they'd done anything wrong. Naturally, I wasn't about to let them off the hook that easily. So, I did what any reasonable person would do in my situation. I showed up to their special meeting with Steve in tow. Now, if you've never had the pleasure of watching a seasoned lawyer like Steve go toe-to-toe with a group of overzealous HOA board members, let me paint you a picture. Imagine a pack of chihuahuas yapping furiously at a very large and very unimpressed Great Dane. That's pretty much how it went down. Steve started by calmly laying out all the ways the HOA had violated state law, from imposing fines without proper notice to installing a fence without homeowner consent, and then proceeded to explain exactly what would happen if they didn't rectify the situation immediately. Under Texas law, he said in his best courtroom voice, you are not only liable for damages, but could also face significant penalties for failing to comply with state regulations. Linda tried to interrupt at one point, something about how they were just trying to protect the community. But Steve shut her down faster than you can say cease and desist. With all due respect, he said coolly, your personal intentions are irrelevant. What matters is that your actions were illegal. By the time he finished speaking, Linda looked like she was about 2 seconds away from either bursting into tears or flipping over the table in frustration. Meanwhile, Gary and a couple of other board members were nodding along like they'd just seen the light for the first time. In the end, it wasn't even a contest. The board voted unanimously to remove the barbed wire fence and waive all fines against my dad. They also agreed to revise their bylaws to ensure something like this never happened again, which was basically their way of saying, please don't sue us. As satisfying as it was to watch Linda squirm during that meeting, what happened next was even better. A few days after the fence came down, which, by the way, felt like watching Berlin Wall-level history in the making, I started hearing rumors that Linda had resigned as HOA president. First, I didn't believe it. After all, this was Linda we were talking about, the woman who once tried to fine someone for having Christmas lights up past January 1st. But sure enough, when I checked the HOA website later that week, her name was nowhere to be found. In her place, none other than Gary. Now, I'm not saying Gary is some kind of hero or anything, let's not get carried away, but at least he seemed willing to listen and actually follow the rules instead of making them up as he went along. And honestly, that's all we really wanted in the first place. As for my dad, he took the whole thing in stride like he always does. When I told him about Linda stepping down, he just shrugged and said, well, I guess she finally realized she picked the wrong fight. And you know what? He's right. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about a fence or some ridiculous fines. It was about standing up for what's right and reminding people like Linda that they don't get to steamroll over everyone else just because they have a title or a little bit of power. So yeah, maybe it took some time and effort and more legal jargon than I ever wanted to learn. But in the end, Totally worth it. With Linda officially dethroned and the barbed wire fence relegated to whatever scrapyard accepts monuments to HOA overreach, you'd think the story would end there. But no, because as it turns out, when you take down an HOA president who's been ruling with an iron fist and a clipboard, you don't just win a battle, you inherit a mess. And by mess, I mean the kind of bureaucratic chaos that makes you wonder if maybe the raccoons were running the show all along. The first sign of trouble came when Gary, our reluctant new HOA president, called me up one evening. Now, I'd barely spoken to Gary outside of HOA meetings, so hearing his voice on the other end of the line was a bit of a surprise. "Hey, Jack," he began hesitantly, like someone about to ask for a kidney. "I was wondering if you could help me with something." "Sure," I said cautiously. "What's up?" "Well," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly. "It's about the HOA records. They're, missing." "Missing?" I repeated, trying not to laugh. "What do you mean, missing?" "I mean Linda took them," he admitted sheepishly. "All of them. The bylaws, the financial reports, the meeting minutes, everything." At this point, I couldn't decide whether to be furious or impressed. On one hand, it was a blatant act of pettiness that would have made even a middle school drama queen proud. On the other hand, okay, no, it was just petty. Classic Linda. "Did she say why she took them?" I asked. "She claimed they're her personal property," Gary explained with a sigh. "But obviously that's not true. Obviously, HOA records are supposed to belong to the association, not the person who happens to be in charge at any given time. It's like if a CEO got fired and decided to take the company's servers home as a souvenir. Completely ridiculous, and also illegal." "Well," I said after a moment of thought, "have you tried asking her nicely to give them back?" Gary let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I tried," he said. "She told me she'd consider it if we reinstated her as president." I nearly choked on my drink at that one. Reinstated as president? After everything she'd done? That was like asking someone to rehire their arsonist neighbor as a firefighter. "Okay," I said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. Step 1. Document everything. If Linda wanted to play dirty, we were going to play smart. Again." Gary sent me an email summarizing his conversations with her, because nothing says paper trail like an email timestamp, and I forwarded it straight to Steve. Step 2. Involve the authorities. Now, normally I'm not one for calling in reinforcements unless absolutely necessary, but this was one of those times when it felt justified. So Steve drafted yet another letter, this time addressed directly to Linda, informing her that withholding HOA records constituted theft under Texas law and that if she didn't return them within 7 days, we'd be filing a police report. And step 3? Well, step 3 was my favorite: public humiliation. You see, while Steve handled the legal side of things, I decided to take matters into my own hands on the community front. Armed with nothing but my laptop and an overdeveloped sense of spite, I created a website called The Real HOA Files. It featured everything we'd uncovered about Linda's reign of terror, from her illegal fines to her misuse of HOA funds, and even included a section for residents to share their own horror stories. Within hours of launching the site, it went viral, at least by small-town standards. Neighbors who'd never spoken to each other before were suddenly bonding over shared grievances like they were contestants on some kind of HOA survivor show. People started showing up at board meetings just to see what drama would unfold next. And best of all, Linda couldn't do anything about it because every single thing on that website was backed up by evidence. By day 5 of our 7-day ultimatum, Linda finally caved. She showed up at Gary's house with 2 cardboard boxes full of records and an expression that could have curdled milk. "There," she said curtly as she dropped them on his porch. "Happy now?" Gary thanked her politely, because he's too nice for his own good, but she just turned on her heel and stormed off without another word. With the records finally back where they belonged, or at least as close as they were going to get, we got to work sorting through them. And let me tell you, it was like opening Pandora's box. For starters, there were receipts for things that had absolutely nothing to do with HOA business, like $200 spent at a nail salon and $500 for what appeared to be custom monogram stationery, because apparently Linda thought being HOA president required personalized thank you notes. There were also entire sections of meeting minutes that had been conveniently edited or outright deleted, probably because they didn't paint Linda in the best light. But perhaps most shocking of all was what we found in the financial reports. Thousands of dollars in unaccounted for expenses labeled only as miscellaneous. Miscellaneous? Really? That's the kind of thing you write when you're trying to hide something, or when you're too lazy to come up with a better excuse. Armed with this new information, we called yet another special meeting, this time inviting every single resident in the community, and laid everything out for them. The missing records, the shady financials, even Linda's attempt at blackmailing Gary into reinstating her as president. The response was overwhelming, and not in Linda's favor. By the end of the meeting, residents were calling for an official audit of HOA finances and demanding stricter oversight moving forward. As for Linda, well, let's just say she didn't stick around long enough to hear everyone's feedback. She left halfway through the meeting with her head held high, but not before muttering something under her breath about how ungrateful we all were for everything she'd done for the community. Ungrateful? Maybe. But justified? Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, and after everything we'd been through, it wasn't just about fences or fines or even missing records anymore. It was about holding people accountable and making sure no one else had to deal with another Linda ever again. And honestly, that felt pretty damn good. After Linda's grand exit from the HOA meeting, a walk of shame so dramatic it could have been set to the theme song from Curb Your Enthusiasm. You'd think the saga would finally be over. But no, because, as it turns out, cleaning up the mess left behind by an HOA dictator is a lot like trying to untangle a box of Christmas lights. Frustrating, time-consuming, and guaranteed to make you question your life choices. The first order of business was the audit. Now, I'm not an accountant, but even I could tell that the HOA's finances looked like they'd been managed by someone who thought Excel was just a workout program. There were missing receipts, unexplained charges, and a suspiciously large line item labeled Miscellaneous Community Improvements, which, as far as anyone could tell, consisted entirely of Linda's personal expenses. Nail salon visits? Check. Custom stationery? Check. A $300 charge for what appeared to be a catered lunch at Olive Garden. Oh yeah, that was in there too. Gary, bless his heart, tried to make sense of it all, but he was clearly in over his head. So he did what any reasonable person would do when faced with an insurmountable problem. He outsourced it. He hired an actual accountant, a no-nonsense woman named Barbara who looked like she could balance a budget in her sleep and had zero patience for nonsense. Barbara didn't just audit the books. She obliterated them. Within a week, she'd compiled a report so damning it could have doubled as evidence in a criminal trial. According to her findings, Linda had misappropriated nearly $15,000 during her time as HOA president. 15 grand. That's not just petty theft. That's, I'm auditioning for my own episode of American Greed, Levels of Corruption. Naturally, this revelation sent shockwaves through the community. People who'd barely paid attention to HOA meetings before were suddenly showing up in droves, demanding answers and refunds. One guy even brought a pitchfork to the next meeting, though I'm pretty sure that was more for dramatic effect than anything else. Linda, meanwhile, had gone radio silent. No emails, no phone calls, not even one of her trademark passive-aggressive letters. It was almost like she'd vanished into thin air, or at least retreated to whatever lair HOA villains go to when their schemes fall apart. But just when we thought we'd seen the last of her, Linda made one final attempt to reclaim her throne, or at least salvage what was left of her reputation. She filed a lawsuit against the HOA. Yes, you heard that right. She sued us. Her claim? Defamation of character. Now, I'm no legal expert, that's Steve's department, but even I knew this was ridiculous. Everything we'd said about Linda was backed up by hard evidence. Her own receipts and records. If anything, she'd defamed herself. But that didn't stop her from dragging us into court anyway. The trial, or as I like to call it, the people versus Linda's ego, was equal parts infuriating and hilarious. On one hand, it was maddening to see her try to paint herself as the victim after everything she'd done. On the other hand, well, let's just say her lawyer wasn't exactly Clarence Darrow. For starters, he kept mispronouncing basic legal terms, at one point referring to fiduciary duty as fiduciary duty, which made me wonder if he'd gotten his law degree from a cereal box. Then there was his opening statement, which included gems like, "My client only wanted what was best for the community," and "This is all just a big misunderstanding." Sure it was. Steve, on the other hand, was in his element. He tore Linda's case apart piece by piece with all the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel, and maybe just a little bit of glee. "Your Honor," he said at one point while holding up Barbara's audit report for everyone in the courtroom to see, "The only thing my clients are guilty of is exposing corruption and protecting their community from further harm." Mic drop. The judge didn't even need much time to deliberate. He ruled in our favor almost immediately and dismissed Linda's case with prejudice, which basically means she couldn't come back and try this nonsense again later. As we walked out of the courtroom that day, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Not just for me and my dad, but for everyone in our community who'd had to put up with Linda's antics for far too long. But here's the thing about closure. It doesn't always come neatly wrapped with a bow on top. Sure, we'd won the legal battle and exposed Linda for who she really was, but there were still lingering issues to deal with. The HOA still needed rebuilding from the ground up, figuratively speaking, and trust within the community had been fractured by years of mismanagement. So Gary, bless him again, decided to step down as president and hold new elections for all board positions. And guess who got nominated as his replacement? That's right, me. At first, I thought it was a joke, some kind of elaborate prank cooked up by my neighbors as payback for all those times I'd borrowed their lawnmowers without asking. Sorry about that. But no, they were serious. "Jack," Gary said earnestly during one particularly awkward conversation over coffee at the local diner, "you're exactly what this community needs right now. Someone who isn't afraid to stand up for what's right." I tried to protest. Really tried, but eventually caved under the weight of his puppy dog eyes and relentless optimism. And so began my unexpected tenure as HOA president. A role I never wanted but somehow ended up embracing anyway because hey, if Linda could do it badly, surely I could do it better. Taking on the role of HOA president was like being handed the keys to a haunted house. Exciting, terrifying, and full of skeletons in the closet. But hey, after everything we'd been through with Linda, I figured it couldn't get any worse. Spoiler alert, it didn't. In fact, it turned out to be one of the most unexpectedly hilarious and rewarding experiences of my life. Now, let's be clear. I didn't exactly have a grand vision for the HOA when I took over. My goals were simple: get rid of the ridiculous rules, fix the broken systems, and make sure no one ever had to deal with another Linda-esque reign of terror again. And honestly, the bar was so low that even baby steps felt like giant leaps. The first thing I did was hold a community meeting to get input from the residents. Instead of the usual passive-aggressive PowerPoint presentation and awkward silence, I decided to make it fun. We set up a barbecue in the park, handed out free hot dogs, and called it the Great HOA Reset. People showed up in droves, probably because of the free food, but they stayed because they actually felt like their opinions mattered for once. We started by tackling the bylaws. Now, if you've never had the pleasure of rewriting HOA bylaws, let me tell you, it's like trying to translate Shakespeare into emojis. But with a little help from Steve, who is now officially our unofficial legal advisor, and Barbara, our resident numbers wizard, we managed to simplify things into something that actually made sense. Gone were the rules about white fences and lawn ornaments. Instead, we focused on practical stuff, like making sure people kept their properties safe and clean without micromanaging their lives. We even added a clause about raccoon-proof trash cans, just for good measure. Next up was transparency. Under Linda's regime, HOA meetings had been more secretive than Area 51. So we decided to live stream them on Facebook for anyone who couldn't attend in person. This turned out to be a game changer. Not only because it kept everyone informed, but also because it gave us an excuse to use fun hashtags like #HOAUnfiltered and #FenceGate2023. And then there was the budget. Remember that $15,000 Linda had misappropriated? Well, thanks to Barbara's meticulous auditing skills and some creative fundraising ideas, shout out to our bake sale team, we managed to recover most of it. We used the money to fix up the community center, install better lighting in public areas, and even set up a small scholarship fund for local kids. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There were still moments of chaos, like the time someone tried to propose a rule banning inflatable holiday decorations because they thought they were tacky, or the time Gary accidentally sent out an email with everyone's addresses visible in the CC field instead of BCC. Cue several awkward conversations. But overall, things were looking up. And then came the cherry on top, the moment that made all the hard work worth it. One day, as I was driving out to my dad's cabin for some much-needed R&R, I noticed something new at the entrance to our community. It was a sign, a big wooden one with fancy lettering that read, "Welcome to Deerwood Estates, the friendliest community in Texas." Underneath that, a smaller sign that said, "No barbed wire allowed." I nearly swerved off the road laughing. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch with my dad watching the sun set over the trees, he turned to me with a grin. "Well," he said casually, "looks like you made quite an impact." "Yeah," I replied with a chuckle. "Who would have thought?" He raised his beer in a toast to standing up for what's right and having a little fun along the way. "To that," I agreed. And honestly, that's what this whole experience had been about. Not just taking down Linda or fixing broken systems, but proving that even in the most absurd situations, you can make a difference if you're willing to put in the effort and maybe throw in a little humor for good measure. So here's my advice to anyone dealing with their own HOA drama, or any kind of bureaucratic nonsense for that matter. Don't let them push you around. Learn your rights, stand your ground, and don't be afraid to call out ridiculousness when you see it. And if all else fails, get yourself a lawyer like Steve and an accountant like Barbara. They're worth their weight in gold. Oh, and one last thing. If you enjoyed this story, or if you've ever wanted revenge against an HOA, do me a favor, like this video, share it with your friends, leave a comment below about your own HOA horror stories, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tales of suburban chaos and justice served hot. Thanks for watching, and remember, no barbed wire allowed.